I never thought my best friend would become my biggest financial burden. Am I the asshole for kicking her out when she wouldn't pay her share of rent and bills? I'm a 26-year-old woman who's been sharing an apartment with my best friend, Jenna, 25, for about a year now. Jenna and I have been close since high school, so when we both moved to the same city for work, living together felt like the perfect setup. After years of talking about it, we were thrilled to finally make it happen. At first, everything went smoothly. We had movie nights, cooked together, and even hosted a few small parties. It felt like our dream of sharing a space was finally coming true. When we signed the lease, we agreed to split everything 50-50, from rent to utilities. We both had stable, if modest, jobs. Mine in an office role, while Jenna worked as a bartender with an income that varied a bit, but usually allowed her to make ends meet. For the first few months, everything was fine. But then, around springtime, Jenna hit some financial bumps. I noticed her becoming more stressed and quieter, and she eventually confided that work had slowed down, and she was struggling to cover her expenses. She asked if she could pay her share of the rent a bit late that month, and I agreed. She's my best friend after all, and I assumed this was just a temporary setback. But 1 month turned into 2, then 3. She'd occasionally give me a partial payment, but it was never enough to cover her full share, leaving me to make up the difference. I didn't want to pressure her, knowing she was already stressed, so I tried to be patient. We had a few talks where I gently asked how she was doing and reminded her of the need to pay her portion when possible. Every time she apologized, saying she was working on it and that things would improve soon. She always seemed to have a plan, and I wanted to trust her. After about 4 months of me covering most of our expenses, I started to feel the weight of it all. My own savings were dwindling, and I was stretching my budget to make sure we didn't fall behind. I took on extra hours at work, cut back on my spending, and skipped out on things I enjoyed, all to keep up with rent and bills. I didn't want to confront her too harshly, but the strain was getting to me. When we'd discuss it, she'd assure me that she was trying to find a more stable job or pick up extra shifts. One evening, I sat her down for a serious talk, letting her know that while I sympathized with her situation, I couldn't carry her financially forever. I encouraged her to be upfront with me about her finances and asked if she needed help finding a solution. Jenna admitted she was embarrassed and felt like a failure, which broke my heart. She promised she'd do everything she could to catch up on the payments. I wanted to believe her, knowing that she wasn't intentionally trying to take advantage of me. But as more time passed with no real change, my patience began to wear thin. Rent would come due, and there was always a new excuse for why she couldn't pay her share. I suggested that maybe she could sublet her room or look for a part-time job to help with expenses, but she shot down both ideas, saying she didn't want to live with a stranger and that 2 jobs would be overwhelming. It started to feel like she wasn't even considering alternatives, and I began to feel taken for granted. I understand that everyone goes through hard times and needs a little help now and then, but I was starting to drown financially while trying to cover for both of us. About a month ago, I hit my breaking point. I had just been paid, but nearly my entire check went to covering our rent and utilities. It was disheartening to realize I couldn't even enjoy my earnings because they were tied up in keeping us afloat. Frustrated, I came home that night and told Jenna we needed to have a serious talk. I laid everything out. How covering the bills had taken a toll on my finances, how I'd been eating cheap meals and turning down outings just to make sure we didn't fall behind, and how it felt like she wasn't making any real effort to improve her situation. I told her plainly that if she couldn't start paying her share consistently, she would have to move out. Jenna got defensive, insisting she was doing her best and saying it wasn't fair of me to push her like this, especially since we're best friends and friends are supposed to help each other out. Her words stung, and I reminded her that I'd been supporting her for months and that there was a limit to how much I could sacrifice. The conversation escalated quickly, and we both said things we regretted. She accused me of not being supportive during her toughest moments, and I expressed my frustration that she didn't seem to be trying hard enough to resolve things. Update 1. That night left a bitter taste in my mouth, and I barely slept. I kept replaying our conversation, second-guessing myself. Was I too harsh? Was I doing the right thing? The next morning, I woke up with a resolution. I wasn't trying to toss Jenna onto the street. I just couldn't keep supporting both of us indefinitely. So, I tried again. When I brought it up, Jenna seemed in a better mood. I told her straight, if she could find a way to consistently contribute her share of the rent and utilities, she could stay. I wasn't asking for miracles, just some effort to keep our arrangement fair. She looked visibly relieved and asked for just one more month to get things together. She promised that this time would be different. She said she'd focus on securing a job, maybe even a full-time one if bartending continued to be unreliable. Despite my doubts, I wanted to believe her, so I agreed. I would cover her part for another month, but I made it clear that this was the last time. She thanked me, her sincerity visible, and I felt cautiously optimistic. But that feeling didn't last. The very next day, I asked how the job search was going, expecting at least a small update. Maybe that she'd polished her resume or started browsing online listings. But instead, she admitted she hadn't started yet. She said she needed to clear her mind, maybe spend the day relaxing before she could focus on the hunt. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I tried to stay patient. After all, job hunting is stressful, so maybe a day of decompression would help her get into the right mindset. But then, the following day, I asked again, hoping for better news. She shrugged and said no, she hadn't applied to anything yet. She'd been thinking about what kind of job she wanted, but hadn't actually taken any steps. I could feel my patience stretching thin, but I held back, gently reminding her that she needed to start applying soon. She just nodded, promising she'd get on it the next day. The next day came and went, but nothing had changed. When I brought it up, she brushed it off again, saying she had a headache and didn't feel up to it. By the fourth day, I felt my frustration boiling over, and I couldn't help but confront her more directly. I asked why she wasn't taking this seriously, given the situation we were both in. Her response was defensive. She told me she was tired and needed a mental break before diving into job hunting. She kept insisting that she'd find something soon, that she just needed a bit more time. I understood that searching for work could be overwhelming, but by this point, I was starting to feel like she was avoiding it altogether. After nearly 2 weeks, it became crystal clear that Jenna hadn't made any significant progress. Every time I checked in, she dodged the question or gave vague responses about looking for the right opportunity. I struggled to make sense of how she could be so casual about finding a solution to her situation. It felt as if she was waiting for some miracle to come along, and I just couldn't wrap my head around why she wasn't actively trying. I was running out of both patience and understanding, but I didn't know what else to say. Update 2, it was the second to last day of the month, and the pressure was suffocating. Every day that passed without Jenna making progress only intensified my worry. I'd hoped, maybe naively, that she'd surprise me with a plan or some good news. But each time I brought up the topic, it was just more excuses. My anxiety was so bad that I was barely sleeping, my thoughts constantly churning about what I'd do if she didn't pull through. As I tried to convince myself I'd done the right thing by giving her another month, I started to question if I'd just made a huge mistake. That evening, I decided to try one more conversation. I walked toward her room, mentally preparing myself for yet another excuse, when I saw something that stopped me cold. There, on her bed, Jenna had stacks of cash spread out in front of her. It was no small amount either. It was a serious sum of money, enough to make me feel a wave of shock and disbelief. For a brief moment, I thought maybe she'd landed a job and hadn't told me yet. Maybe this was her way of surprising me with her share of the rent. But as I stood there, dumbfounded, she noticed me. I asked her, trying to keep my voice steady, where the money had come from. She didn't even look surprised or guilty. She just casually explained that her parents had sent it to her. My mind whirled, but I figured that at least now she could finally pay her portion. I felt a wave of relief, like I could finally breathe a little easier. With a half smile, I told her she could use the money to pay her share of the rent and utilities. But instead of agreeing, Jenna looked at me, genuinely surprised, and calmly said that the money was hers to use as she pleased, not for rent. She explained that her parents had given it to her to take care of herself, and that she planned to pay her share only when she found a job. I could feel the relief evaporate, turning quickly into frustration and confusion. She had all this cash sitting there, and yet she didn't think it was her responsibility to pay me back? I asked, barely believing what I was hearing, if she'd found any work, any leads at all, and she just shrugged and said no. There wasn't even a hint of apology in her voice. only the casual tone of someone who thought I'd be fine with her answer. I stood there, staring at her, stunned that she'd let an entire month slip by with no tangible effort, no job prospects, and now no intention of using the money she did have to pay her part. She went on to say her parents had given her that cash specifically for her personal expenses, things she wanted or needed for herself. Rent, according to her, didn't fall under that category. She said she was going to hold on to it and pay me eventually, whenever she landed a job. What really broke me was when she added that I should just give her another month to figure things out because, as she put it, friends help each other out. It felt surreal, like I was trapped in a bad dream. She still had no job, was sitting on enough money to cover months of rent, and yet she was expecting me to continue covering for her. I didn't know what to say. I was angry, yes, but even more than that, I was hurt. I had stretched myself thin for her, covering her share of everything and making sacrifices just to keep us both stable. And here she was, acting like it was nothing, like I should just keep going because we were friends. She didn't seem to realize or care that I was struggling too. It was as if she couldn't comprehend the weight I'd been carrying to support us. My frustration boiled over, and I left her room before I could say something I'd regret. Sitting alone in my own room, I replayed everything that had happened over the last few months. Every excuse, every vague promise, every time I'd paid her way, hoping she'd make it right. In that moment, the reality hit hard. She had never truly intended to take responsibility. I'd tried so hard to be a good friend, to support her, to trust that she'd eventually come through, but now I saw the situation for what it was. She was using our friendship as an escape route, an excuse not to address her issues. The longer I sat there, the angrier I became, not just at her, but at myself for letting this go on as long as it had. I realized I was done feeling guilty and sacrificing my own well-being for someone who was clearly willing to take advantage of my kindness. The final straw was knowing that she had the money and simply chose not to pay. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to disregard everything I'd done to keep us both afloat. That stung in a way that's hard to describe. It felt like a betrayal of the trust I'd put in her, and after everything, it was a breaking point I couldn't ignore. By the end of that night, I made up my mind. If she didn't come up with the rent by the next day, she'd have to leave. I knew it would be hard. I didn't want her to be left in a difficult spot, but I also couldn't keep sacrificing my own stability for someone who clearly wasn't willing to take responsibility. I felt sad, even a bit guilty, but I also felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. It was time to look out for myself. Update 3. The end of the month finally arrived, and with it, the dreaded conversation I'd been putting off. For weeks, I'd been caught in a cycle of doubt, asking myself if I was making the right decision. But every time I thought about the sacrifices I'd made to keep us afloat, only to see Jenna act like it wasn't her problem, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. It was time to face reality, even if it meant jeopardizing our friendship. I couldn't let her take advantage of me anymore. That evening, I went to her room, mentally prepared for a difficult discussion. There she was, lounging on her bed, scrolling through her phone as if nothing was wrong. It struck me as unbelievable. While I was working extra hours and stressing about bills, she seemed completely unbothered, as if she had no idea of the toll this was taking on me. Taking a deep breath, I asked her if she'd made any progress on finding a job. She glanced up, her face showing only mild surprise, and said, "No, of course not. You really think I'd find something decent in just a month?" Her nonchalance made my frustration boil over. I reminded her that I had covered for her one last time on the condition that she would actively look for work, yet it was clear she hadn't even tried. I told her she needed to start paying her part with the money her parents had sent her, or she'd have to move out. She just stared at me in shock, her mouth slightly open, as if I just suggested something completely outrageous. She then told me she couldn't use the money for rent because her parents had given it to her for personal expenses. Friends, she argued, didn't just abandon each other when things got rough. I felt disbelief mixing with anger. For months, I'd been bending over backward to make sure she had a place to stay, covering bills, giving up my own comfort, and now she had the nerve to imply that I was betraying our friendship. I told her exactly how I felt, how tired I was of supporting us both, of watching her make no effort to change her situation. I'd sacrificed my own well-being, time, and money, and all I'd received in return were excuses. It hurt to realize that she'd been using my friendship as a cushion, expecting me to keep covering for her indefinitely. She looked stunned, but I pressed on. I needed her to understand just how much this had affected me. I told her that this wasn't about friendship anymore. It was about respect. I had been more than fair, more than generous, but she seemed to think it was fine for me to bear the burden while she kept her personal money for herself. I informed her that I would give her some time to pack, but she needed to find another place to stay. I couldn't keep sacrificing my stability for her lack of responsibility. She tried to argue, to say she just needed more time, but I'd heard it all before. This conversation felt like a repeat of all the others. Except this time, I was resolute. She kept bringing up how we were friends, insisting that friends didn't just turn their backs, but I'd reached my limit. I couldn't bear another round of excuses, and I cut her off, letting her know that my decision was final. She was going to have to move out. After I left her room, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Part of me was grateful that I wouldn't have to keep stressing about how to make ends meet while covering her share, but another part of me felt like I'd let her down, like I'd failed as a friend. Her words echoed in my mind. Friends help each other out. And I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I was being too harsh. Yet every time I reconsidered, I remembered everything I'd done to support her. The countless times I'd paid the bills, missed out on things I enjoyed, and worked extra hours, all while she sat on money she could have used but chose not to. I reminded myself that I'd done everything I could to be understanding and supportive, but she hadn't reciprocated. She'd had ample opportunity to step up, to take responsibility, yet she hadn't. Ultimately, I had to look out for myself. I'd reached my breaking point, and I knew I had to set boundaries for my own well-being. I wish things could have turned out differently, and a part of me will always regret that it came to this. But I just couldn't keep ignoring the reality of the situation. I had given Jenna chance after chance, and she had let them slip by. I hated that it ended this way, but I couldn't keep sacrificing my own stability for someone who wouldn't take responsibility. Commentary time. This story is such a powerful look at the complexities of friendship, responsibility, and self-respect. OP's journey shows us how even the best of friends can take advantage when boundaries and respect get lost in the mix. At first, OP's support for Jenna felt like what anyone would do for a close friend, especially after years of planning to live together. But as the months wore on, the lack of effort from Jenna turned what should have been a shared responsibility into a heavy burden for OP alone. Jenna's refusal to even consider reasonable solutions, like finding part-time work or using the funds her parents had sent, shows a disregard not only for the financial burden OP was carrying, but also for the spirit of friendship they had once shared. By sitting on money that could have eased the situation, she turned the arrangement from friendship into an exploitative relationship, expecting OP's patience to last forever. OP's decision to set a final boundary and, ultimately, end the living arrangement wasn't easy, but it was necessary for her peace of mind and stability. This is a story that emphasizes the importance of respecting friendships by ensuring that support is reciprocated. True friends value each other's well-being and don't let one person take on the weight of everything. OP's journey reminds us that sometimes drawing a line in the sand is essential, not just for our financial health, but for our emotional well-being too. What do you think? Have you ever faced a similar situation where friendship clashed with financial responsibility? Share your experiences and advice in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more real-life stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your insights could really help others facing a similar dilemma. Let's support each other in navigating these tricky situations.